Nothing works until you do the work. Thank you for being with me, and thank you for investing in the 6 inches between your two ears. That's the most important real estate. Number one, how do you build passive income with rates so high? Number two, how will the abolishment of negative gearing affect house prices? Probably going to happen. Number three, how do you buy property remotely without a buyer's agent? Number four, how long does it take every month to manage a double-digit property portfolio? And how do you use a property manager to actually ease that burden? These are the four questions that we'll be discussing. I was interviewed on the Money Puzzle podcast by James Kirby, the chief wealth editor at The Australian. Great, intelligible discussion, I hope. You'll get a ton of value from it. Negative gearing, passive income, managing a portfolio, and buying without a buyer's agent. Will answer all these four questions. Let me know what you think in either the answers to each question or how you think I answered them. Here we go. Welcome to the Oz Property Investment Mastery Podcast. My name's PK and I help busy people build passive income by buying top 5% growth and cash flow property and build a portfolio using data without wasting months doing research, spending weekends at inspection or catching flights, or dropping $10,000 to $20,000 on buyer's agents every single time. So if you're confused, lack confidence, and just overwhelmed with all the information and marketing misinformation available online and don't know where to start, then this show is for you.
So my guest today is PK Gupta, and he is a well-known person in the property market, a property expert for some years now, and also is an educator in the space and runs courses and that sort of thing. How are you, PK?
Very well, thanks. James, yourself?
Good, nice to have you on. And nice to have, always an interesting time to talk to you. I know you've got your finger in a lot of pies. And you're very active in the market yourself, personally, I know, so it should be good to talk to you in very a line of inquiry that we could pick up. But for me, I think when people think of you or hear of you, often they hear this notion, this concept, some might say promise, of passive investing. And passive investing has become better known now in recent years because of ETFs, which are so popular now, and the people realize you can just actually, there are things you can sit back and let it happen if you like, investing wise. I don't think that's ever the case in property. But tell me what you mean by passive investing.
Sure. Yeah, I think, it depends really what we'd like to discuss. There's passive investing and then there's passive income investing. I think the notion, let's go with the first one, passive investing, the notion that real estate is never really a set and forget type of asset class is very much true. I don't think you can acquire a portfolio of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many properties and expect one day to be sitting on the beach and never have to worry about them all and just magically, the dividends or the rents are arriving in your bank account. I don't think it works quite like that. But I think neither is at the opposite extreme of the scale or the spectrum. So I think a lot of people often, especially in the media, it's touted that, the tenants have trashed the place or there's been a flood and et cetera, a million and one horror stories. And of course, those are true and that does happen. But it's really few and far between and quite the exception rather than the rule. So I think passive investing is really about buying good, solid assets with good, solid bones. If you really don't want to add any value, then you don't have to, as long as you've done the due diligence on the way in, using a good, solid property manager that's trustworthy, knows what they're doing. And in that way, it's a contentious topic these days, but let me say it anyway, then you can build a 5 to 10 property portfolio and it really doesn't take more than 2 or 3 hours a month to manage. Of course, I'd be lying if I said that every 4 to 6 to 8 years there's not significant issues that may come up, like a hot water cylinder or a leaking roof that needs a tradie out, things like that. But once again, the property manager can do that work for you, gives you a few quotes, and you simply pay the bill. I'm not sure if that's what you intended by the question, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah. And okay, well, I will leave that there untouched, uncriticized for the moment. And tell me, what do you mean by passive income then?
Sure. And I think this is perhaps a more interesting topic as well, James, because perhaps a lot of your audience, even my audience, are Sydney and Melbourne based. And when you buy an investment property in Sydney or Melbourne, I don't think anyone can hand on heart and say that's going to give you a passive income, because let's be honest, the market there generally yields in both those cities 2 to 4% up and down, of course.
Yeah.
And so how is it that property can give passive income in this day and age? I mean, you read all those books from the 90s, 80s, etc. But I still firmly believe it works. However, it takes a little bit longer, and you need to be a little bit more, or have a bit more dexterity in your strategy. So the way that, in a nutshell, not to go on, but I don't think it's any secret. You buy good cash flow properties that almost pay for themselves. Let's say 2 or 3 years ago were paying for themselves with lower rates. Right now might be costing you a bit. You accumulate the number of properties in the right locations with a yield of, let's say, 5 to 6 to 7%. And we're not talking mining towns here, talking capital cities or large major regional centers. And it's just a waiting game. Everyone knows what happens to real estate over the long term and in Australia, but that can be, I would say, accelerated if you use the right data. Happy to go into that as well. And then over the long term, 10, 20 years from now, as you've started to pay some of those properties off, or even if you've just stayed on interest only, and let's say a lot of them have doubled in value or even more or even less, then you can sell half your portfolio, let's say, and take the profits. Of course, there's tax implications, etc., and use those gains to pay off the debt of the remaining properties. So let's say you started with 6, after 10, 20 years, you sell 3, and you use the profits after CGT to pay off the debt of the remaining 3 that you hold. And those 3 assets are now unencumbered, and that's really where the passive income story kicks in. It's not really on the way so much, because we all know real estate in a moment in time in Australia is not really a fantastically yielding asset class, but it is the asset class that generally outperforms the others, especially if you include leverage from a growth perspective for the everyday person. So that's sort of my thesis on that one, James.
Okay. I mean, just in terms of just zoning in on something, one thing you did say was, I don't know what the yields were once upon a time, but I presume they were better than they are now. And in the big cities, they are too. Let's call it 3%, right? Is the yield, and you're borrowing at 6, and inflation is 4, and really there is no income worth talking about in the first year anyway from those properties, or perhaps later. So it means to me, to fulfill, even to try and justify the concept you've laid out, which is almost like a lifelong program, isn't it, really, being realistic?
It definitely is. It definitely is not a get-rich-quick type of thing.
Yeah, but even assuming you do it step by step, it means you're not buying in the middle of the big cities. To get those yields, you couldn't.
Generally not buying at all in Melbourne and Sydney anymore. And just to go back a little bit, yields used to be higher. I mean, not that I'm 60 years old or anything, but we can use data to see what history was. Yields used to be touching 10% in a lot of capital cities once upon a time, but then interest rates were higher as well back in the 80s and 90s. So it all comes out in the wash. But if you're looking at capital cities, let's say Adelaide, let's say Perth, let's say Brisbane, large regional centers, Bendigo, Toowoomba, Mount Gambier, etc., then, well, 2 things I just want to say. First of all, the yields in these areas are well above 5%. So yes, granted, they're not going to be putting thousands of dollars in your pocket from day dot, but once again, it's a long-term strategy. And the second thing is these areas, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, grow just as well as Sydney or Melbourne over the long term. And just a quick example is a little old place like Launceston in Tassie. Over the last 35 years, it's grown just as well as Sydney. So you're not sacrificing growth just to chase yield.
I didn't know that. That's very interesting. Okay, so let's say I go with you, and let's say I'm I expect, again, that being realistic, you've got to be, I don't know, you want a 20, 25-year time horizon here, I would think. So you can't be hitting into this at 60. I don't think so. But unless you are a different type of person than most people are when they look at that age, and in terms of their risk and their willingness and their longevity expectations, etc. But so let's say I take everything on board. Let's say I like the concept. Let's say I really want to examine it, and I am prepared to do the work. Just to zone in on the work, 2 or 3 hours. I don't know about that. I at one stage I had 3 apartments, and it seemed to me like it was every other day. I don't know why. It also seemed to me that if an apartment was quiet for a year, then the following year there was going to be twice as much trouble as the previous year. It was like there was no such thing as if there was a quiet period, then you pay for it later. So maybe 2 or 3 hours for you, but being realistic, what should people think of? And are there programs people can buy to manage more than one property? Because I never had a proper program when I was doing it.
Yeah, no, I don't have a proper program either. I mean, I'd love to say, here's my app or whatever, but
Yeah, off the shelf. Yeah,
I'm kind of old school. I use Excel to, I have an investment banking background, so I like Excel. I just use that to manage my properties. But just to delve into that, in terms of the time aspect, of course, the process of buying a property is not simply 2 or 3 hours. It's, I like to say it's generally 3 to 5 hours over 1 or 2 months, 3 to 5 hours a week, that is, over 1 or 2 months. But then once you have that asset, I'll give you an example. And of course, not intending to cherry pick examples, but I have a fairly large portfolio and just a sort of the run-of-the-mill average type of properties in Ferny Hills. It's a high set, sort of 1970s kind of post-war type house in Brisbane. It's on a bit of a slope as well, which was a mistake that I made, and it has a bit of a drainage problem. Now, I would say in the first 2 or 3 years, it required a little bit more maintenance, maybe $4,000 or $5,000 a year in maintenance. I had to get some trees cut and fix the drainage problem and do a bit of a cosmetic renovation. And it's an old house, mind you, and it's not brick either. So some of the mistakes that I made. But since that time, I mean, it's cost about $2,000, $2,000 or $2,500 per annum in maintenance. And the property manager, bless her, she's done all that work for me. Of course, it's never nice to get that email from the property manager saying, oh, there's leaves stuck in the gutter, tenant is complaining. It's never nice to receive that. But when I receive something like that once every 3 months, and yes, it costs money, but I don't need to put any time into it. The manager takes care of it for me. And in the meantime, that property is more than doubled and giving me a good income now. So I sort of think it's quite worthwhile.
How do you choose the property managers? Again, at one stage, I remember I had 3 different property managers, and a lot hinged on the nature of that property manager. Some of them were so good, and some of them were really silly and time wasters for me, and almost irritating in that you were being contacted about very little. And I had always thought a property manager managed it, that I had to manage the property manager. It's kind of the nightmare scenario, isn't it? So how do you choose them? And do you have is it the one group that you use across the country, or do you have different people?
No, I mean, it's a local property manager for every property in different cities and different states that we have. And I think, yeah, like I can empathize with that because I've been through that as well, James. When you land a not so great property manager, it sort of puts you off investing because everything rides on them. I mean, they're like your CEO for that property, and you're the founder or the shareholder or whatever the case may be, so to speak. And I found that, I mean, I don't want to cast any stereotypes here, but the best property managers are those who are investors themselves. They've been in the game for 10, 20 years. They're not just, fresh out of TAFE or fresh out of uni in their early 20s, making 60 grand, not really caring. And the most annoying thing is a nonchalant property manager who sort of says, oh yeah, the tenant hasn't been paying for 2 months. Sorry, I forgot to tell you. Like that's not what you want, right?
No, I never had that.
Like anything, how do you find an accountant? How do you find a good broker? They exist. You just have to know how to find them. And one way is just to check if they've done it themselves, if they're investors themselves.
Okay, right. And okay, good tip. Actually, talking about tips and lessons. One of the things I saw you talk about at one stage was about buyers advocates who have become quite baked into the system now, especially if you're an investor. I mean, if I'm going to go and buy a property in Toowoomba where I have never been, well, I'm going to use a buyer's advocate to help me find the property, choose the property, who knows the town, who knows where it works and where it doesn't work. But there is a cost, isn't there? A considerable cost in using them. So what's your view on them as a cost?
What a leading question, James. No, thank you for asking it.
You're welcome. It's like a parliamentary question, a Dorothy Dixer. Yeah.
No, it's obviously I'm very outspoken on this, but I genuinely believe in this. Look, I mean, I can just share my example, right? When I first started investing in real estate, I was living in Sydney at the time. I was a fresh graduate, working in the city in financial services, and I only had a little bit of deposit. And so I was looking around, where can I buy it? And I found this place using sort of my data techniques back in 2011 of East Gosford. And I was working 90 hours a week at JP Morgan. I didn't have any time to do anything really.
Yeah.
And buyers advocates or agents weren't really like a big thing back then. So I was like, how am I going to like just get enough time to go and drive up to the Central Coast and inspect properties and things like that? I was working weekends. And so one day I found a local property manager up there just on the internet, and I called them and I was like, look, I don't even know if I'm allowed to ask you this, but could you please inspect this property that I'm about to make an offer on? I've done all my due diligence, like flood mapping and main road not, there's 30 factors. I did all that online, but I don't want to buy something sight unseen. And the lady, she was like, oh, I've never been asked that before, but yeah, I don't see why not. And I was like, oh, well, that worked. And she was lovely. And she inspected a number of properties for me. And she was on the ground. She was a local. She had been managing properties in that sort of Central Coast area for more than a decade. And it was a terrific transaction, and it's worked out really well for me. And then I just repeated that till now, across 12 properties. And then around 2014, 15, the buyer's advocate world, the buyer's agent world really started to explode. They went from, I'm just making numbers up, from maybe 100 buyer's advocates nationally to now like 4,000. And their whole sales pitch, and I love all the buyer advocates listening to this, so please don't take offense, but the sales pitch was, we'll do the inspections for you because you're interstate or you're remote, you can't do them, and we'll find the best location for you. And I just thought back to my own experience. I found the location using data. Data speaks volumes. And the boots on the ground due diligence was done by my property managers, the housing commission nearby, et cetera, vacancy, tenant appeal. And so I thought, like, these guys, I mean, there's definitely a market for them. And for someone who has no interest in learning and not even 3 to 5 hours a week over 1 or 2 months to learn and implement, then I think buyer advocates are useful. But I think if the spiel is, we do a better job at finding locations, or we do a better job at due diligence on the ground, then just from my own experience, I can't speak for others, but from my experience, I don't buy that.
Do you buy at auction?
I've never bought at auction, and that's probably that's a good thing you raised. That's probably one exception to the rule. There's definitely a sense of experience and what weight that holds. But when you're investing in real estate, especially the thesis that I and my community have, we're not buying in auction predominated cities or states where it's super hot and you're bidding against emotional owner occupiers and things like that.
Okay, you keep well away from that. Okay, and obviously rationally, I could see how it makes sense. All right, before we go to the break, I want to ask you about one other thing. It would always be an issue that the notion of building a portfolio of properties, an investment portfolio of properties with a lifelong or a decade, 2-decade long plan, hinged on a number of things happening. And in our market, it has to be to some extent underpinned by the tax structures around that. You mentioned them yourself, capital gains, and we assume there's a capital gains discount of 50% after a year. We assume there's negative gearing. I presume that's baked into all your assumptions. Isn't that something that is that a risk you just carry because it's always under threat, and politically it's under threat again? Negative gearing would seem to be under threat. Nobody can believe what they say anymore. They say it's not under threat, but we can't believe them now, right? Because they said they wouldn't change the tax system, and they did. So we can't believe them.
We can't believe them. I think, I didn't make up this quote. I don't want to take credit for it, but the future tax policy, economic strength of the country globally, it's like predicting the weather. I don't think anyone can really do that accurately, but it doesn't mean you don't go to work. You just take an umbrella. You still invest, but you do it prudently. Look, I think negative gearing, my humble opinion, is something needs to happen, something must happen, something has to happen. And you won't often get people who are property, quote unquote, professionals say that, but that's my genuine thought, because there's been study after study after study that's been done, including by the RBA, Grattan Institute, etc., that have said that home ownership levels will rise by 5 percentage points to up to about 72.5%. If negative gearing is abolished and things like that. So who as a common and decent citizen can say that that's not a good thing? Obviously higher home ownership is always a good thing. So my thesis is I'm actually a big favor of change in negative gearing, and I talk about this on my YouTube channel a lot. The Grattan Institute also found that the top 10% of income earners got about 50% of the benefits of negative gearing. And so if you're struggling to land your first home, statistics like that really make your blood boil. But on the flip side of that as well, the majority of people who do negatively gear, the majority of them earn less than 80K. So it's not just that property investing in negative gearing is benefiting the oligarchs and moguls and all the rich people in Australia. So I think there needs to be a nuanced approach to this.
But you see it as inevitable by the sounds of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah. Very interesting.
So one more thing, if you don't mind, James, I also should say as well that real estate health in Australia isn't presupposed or predisposed on this tax policy of CGT discounts or negative gearing, and there's various ways to prove that as well. Especially, they've repealed it once before, and it's not like house prices went back 10, 15, 20%. They didn't. So I don't think house prices all of a sudden going to become affordable. RBA did a research report that said that they would fall between 1% and 2%. So that's not exactly, huge from an investment thesis perspective. And my firm opinion, maybe unpopular, is that tax policy alone doesn't create a inflating asset class. Otherwise, the ASX, you can also negatively gear in that, write off your losses, and that would be overinflated versus global indices.
Very true. The one that everyone forgets, as everyone thinks negative gearing is a property thing, it's actually an investment thing, and you can negatively gear shares. But very few people are willing to do so, even though you can come up with some pretty compelling numbers on dividend yields, etc., folks.